morning, viewers. Welcome to today's newspaper review. Let's take a look at the stories dominating today's newspaper headlines. First, we'll start from the Guardian newspaper. On the Guardian newspaper, which is boldly written the big story page on page 4 and 5, Southeast in throes of tertiary healthcare infrastructure crisis. Southeast in throes of tertiary healthcare infrastructure crisis. At the top of the newspaper on page 3, Presidency slams Atiku over U.S. anti-Tinubu lobbying. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. And still on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper, on 2027 election, Northeast political bloc backs Tinubu's second-term bid. This is on 2027 election, how Northeast political blocs are backing Tinubu's second-term bid. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. And still on page 3 of the same newspaper, Wike-led PDP reclaims Oyo Secretariat dismisses functional claims. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. And in the same newspaper, 2027 CSOs flags gaps as INEC assures 2023 technical glitches fixed. To read more on that, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust newspaper. On the Daily Trust newspaper, which is boldly written, transport fares rises as petrol hits 1,400 naira per litre. With the rise of petrol hitting 1,400 per litre, the cost of transportation is now increasing. At the top of the newspaper on page 6, kidnappers of Oyo school children, teachers bag life sentence. This is a good judgment. To read more on that, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. And on page 13 of the newspaper, I have treated 15 patients, says suspected fake doctor. To read more on that, you go to page 13 of the newspaper. And on page 17, Tinubu approves recruitment of 28,000 personnel, 4 new army divisions. To read more on that, you go to page 17 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper on page 6, opposition lawmakers protest as reps pass state police bill. To read more on that, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Vanguard newspaper. On the Vanguard newspaper on page 5, which is boldly written on Christian killings, Nigeria hiring lobbyists to mask insecurity. This is coming from Ted Cruz. To read more on that, you go to page 5 of the newspaper. And at the top of the newspaper on page 8, Tinubu okays expansion of army divisions from 8 to 12. To read more on that, you go to page 8 of the newspaper. And still at the top of the newspaper, on 2027, credible polls, Foundation for Legitimate Governance, coming from Akine, NGE. To read more on that story, you go to page 11 of the newspaper. And still on page 11 of the newspaper, from Obasanjo to Osoba, I didn't deceive AD leaders in 2003. This is coming from the former Nigerian president Obasanjo to Osoba, saying that he didn't deceive AD leaders in 2003. To read more on that, you go to page 11 of the newspaper. And still in the same newspaper, on page 20, life expectancy challenge. Why Nigerians are dying too soon. This is coming from experts. To read more on that, you go to page 20 of the Vanguard newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Punch newspaper. On the Punch newspaper on page 2, which is boldly written, walkout rocks house as state police bill passes. Walkout rocks house as state police bill passes. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. And at the top of the newspaper on page 16, Tinubu expands army to 12 divisions, approves 28,000 recruits. To read more on that story, go to page 8 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper at the top on page 30, about 2003 poll from former Nigerian president Obasanjo fought Osoba, accuses Atiku of impeachment plot. Obasanjo fought Osoba, accuses Atiku of impeachment plot. To read more on that story, go to page 30 of the newspaper. And at the bottom of the newspaper on page 4, death toll in Zamfara. Farmers attack rises to 23. To read more on that story, go to page 4 of the Punch newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun newspaper, on the Daily Sun newspaper, which is boldly written on page 4. Oriri kidnapping. DSS insists on death penalty. Oriri kidnapping, as DSS are insisting on death penalty to those who kidnap the Oriri school children and teachers. To read more on that story, go to page 4 of the Daily Sun newspaper. And at the top of the newspaper on page 5, Tinubu approves expansion of army divisions to 12, recruitment of 28,000 personnel. President Tinubu has approved expansion of army divisions to 12, and he is recruiting 28,000 personnel. To read more on that story, go to page 5 of the Daily Sun newspaper. And at the bottom of the newspaper on page 2, Dangote refinery raises $2.5 billion in Africa's biggest private equity placement. To read more on that story, go to page 2 of the newspaper. And on page 4 of the newspaper at the bottom, IGP unveils 14-day operations against criminals in Benue. To read more on that story, go to page 4 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Matrix newspaper, on the Matrix newspaper, which is boldly written on page 2. Trump's commendation letter to Tinubu unsettles opposition. President Trump's commendation letter to President Tinubu unsettles opposition. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. And at the top of the newspaper on page 3, federal government flags off training of 5,000-meter installers. To read more on that story, go to page 3 of the newspaper. And still in the same newspaper, presidency, Atiku in fresh war of wars over Tinubu's alleged U.S. drug case. To read more on that story, you go to the same page 3 of the newspaper. And still in the same newspaper on page 9, Tinubu expands army to 12 battalions to recruit 28,000 personnel. This particular story is almost in every newspaper. To read more on that story, go to page 9 of the newspaper. And at the bottom of the newspaper on entertainment on page 23, please don't let me die. Ailing actress Ngozi Nwosu seeks public support. To read more on that story, you go to page 23 of the newspaper. And on sports on page 25, Arsenal to table 70 million euros bid for Newcastle's Gumeras. To read more on that story, go to page 25 of the Matrix newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent, on the Daily Independent paper, which is boldly written, opposition reps walk out as House passes state police bill. At the top of the newspaper, 3 terrorists jailed for life over adoption of Oyo pupils and teachers. So the terrorists that kidnapped the Oyo school teachers and pupils are jailed for life. To read more on that story, go to page 4 of the newspaper. And still in the same newspaper on page 6, Dangote refinery raises $2.5 billion in landmark private equity placement. To read more on that story, go to page 6 of the newspaper. And at the bottom of the newspaper on page 29, Tinubu asks army to recruit 28,000 personnel, expand to 12 divisions. To read more on that story on President Tinubu asking army to recruit 28,000 personnel, you go to page 29 of the newspaper. And still in the same newspaper on page 29, ahead of 2027 elections, stakeholders task INEC media on integrity. To read more on that, you go to page 29 of the newspaper. And on page 6, no foreign letter can save Tinubu from Nigeria's judgment. This is coming from the ADC. The ADC that's saying that no foreign letter can save Tinubu from Nigeria's judgment. To read more on that, you go to page 6 of the Daily Independent newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the last newspaper of today, the Nigerian Tribune. On the Nigerian Tribune newspaper, on page 3, Tinubu approves expansion of Nigerian army to 12 divisions. This particular headline is in all the newspaper. To read more on that story, go to page 3 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. And at the top of the newspaper, on page 5, still on the Oriri kidnappers. 3 Oriri kidnappers plead guilty, sentenced to life imprisonment. To read more on that story, go to page 5 of the newspaper. And still at the top of the newspaper on page 19, Obasanjo tackles Osoba on 2003 election. To read more on that, you go to page 19 of the newspaper. And at the bottom of the newspaper on page 4, NSIB begins investigation into Enugu air mishap at Benin Airport. To read more on that, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. Lastly, at the bottom of the newspaper on page 27, police confirm 15 dead as bandits attack Zamfara community. Police confirm 15 dead as bandits attack Zamfara community. To read more on that story, go to page 27 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. And that's all for today's newspaper review. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates. I'm Chidera Esom. Do have a beautiful weekend.